So in the afternoon of September 19th, fighting was raging in multiple areas of the battlefield here. After A.P. Stewart's attack featured in the last episode, Rosecrans decided he would try and flank the Confederate line. He would send a division under the command of Brigadier General Jefferson Davis and a hodgepodge of other units south along the LaFayette Road towards Viniard Field. Now Davis would deploy his small division here. So directly to our front, you had the brigade of Colonel Hans Haig, and to his right, you had the brigade of Brigadier General William Carlin. Now, Carlin's brigade, here's the Lafayette Road. Carlin's brigade was ordered to the Lafayette Road and to lay down. Now, Colonel Hans Haig's brigade was deployed in this general area here, and they would begin by crossing the Lafayette Road and making their way towards this general direction here, near the area of the old log schoolhouse. So we are in the general location of where Hans Haig's brigade would cross the Lafayette Road and begin advancing towards the woodline here. And within Haig's brigade, you had the 25th and the 35th Illinois, the 8th Kansas, the 15th and 8th Wisconsin. So they would advance in this general direction here. And unfortunately for the men of Hans Haig's brigade, General John Gregg's 1,400-man brigade of Bushrod Johnson's division was about 800 yards to our front. And his Confederate forces were lying prone behind makeshift breastworks, and they were waiting for a possible Union attack. Well, Haig's brigade had no idea that these Confederates were to our front, so they would be advancing in this general direction here. All right, so we've made it into the wood line a bit here, and as Haig's brigade was advancing, they would start encountering skirmish fire from General John Gregg's brigade. Now, that skirmish fire would be unfolding right before us here. So Lieutenant Colonel James Turner of the 30th Tennessee was sent out to investigate the gunfire. Well, what he found was his skirmishers were fleeing. He would peer through the thick woods here, and about 50 yards away were two dark lines of blue Union infantry. Just as he was getting ready to turn back to his line, a minie ball would slam into his right breast and knock him from his horse. He would somehow still manage to stagger back to his main line before collapsing. So you had the entirety of Hans Haig's brigade coming directly at you on the camera here, and the Confederate position would be behind you on the camera. So they would come through this area, and they would come to a small rise just before they met the Confederate breastworks there. They would take that small rise, see the Confederates, and deliver essentially a point-blank volley into the Confederate lines. So it's important to note that Haig's brigade would stretch all along this line in this general direction here. So they began duking it out with the entrenched Confederates a couple hundred yards to our front here. And after about 6 or 7 volleys, the 8th Kansas and the 15th Wisconsin were suffering terribly. They would pull back after their 7th volley about 20 yards to avoid a crossfire from a nearby Union battery that was brought up for support. Now, they would fire another dozen rounds from this new location before fixing bayonets and then attempting to charge the Confederate works. Well, the Confederate line held, and because of this, they were able to overlap the Union line, which now exposed the 8th Kansas. So one thing to note is the 8th Kansas entered the wood line here with a mascot, and their mascot was a dog by the name of Old Soldier. And unfortunately for the 8th Kansas, Old Soldier would be killed in action here in the forest of Chickamauga, along with 6 captains, 2 lieutenants, and over 100 men lay wounded and dead in this general area here. So the 8th Kansas was suffering terribly.
They advanced again and again in superior numbers, found several gaps in the line of the army, and flanking us, we had to fall back. Captain James E. Love, 8th Kansas Infantry.
So I always try to envision the fight as best I can. So imagine being an officer or even an enlisted man in Haig's brigade, and you're advancing towards an entrenched enemy. You can see the terrain behind us here and how difficult it would probably be to maintain your command and control. Think about if you're an officer, can you even see the entirety of your regiment, much less the entirety of a brigade? And then all of a sudden, you make a rise and you appear just in front of entrenched Confederate soldiers. So just try to imagine that shock, along with the woods here being filled with the black powder smoke from these rifles here, and just how hard it would be to coordinate any sort of resistance in these forests. Now the shattered remnants of Haig's brigade began streaming out of the wood line here, crossing the LaFayette Road and into this general area here. Now, we mentioned there was an old log house, an old school log house across the way here. Some soldiers took up shelter in there, tried to put up a defense, but they were quickly overwhelmed. So the shattered remnants of Haig's brigade began streaming across the LaFayette Road and into this general area here that you see before us. Now, Haig was trying his best to rally his brigade, and in the process, he was riding on horseback. He would be mortally wounded just at the edge of the woodline you see before you here. So he would be hit, fall from his horse, and eventually he would succumb to his injuries. But this is the spot where Hans Haig would fall mortally wounded trying to rally his brigade. And for orientation purposes, that is where we were in the woodline when Haig's brigade would meet entrenched Confederates.
Not once did he falter or swerve from his duty. Not once did a cloud of gloom overspread his countenance. His comrades fell at right and left, and still he rallied on. From noon until sundown, he was constantly exposed to the fearful fire of the enemy. It was at this hour when his day's work was so nigh done that a ball from a sharpshooter's rifle pierced his bowels, causing the mortal wound. Captain Albert Skostad, 15th Wisconsin Infantry.
Alright, so we moved into Viniard Field. Now, I've also heard this field pronounced Viniard Field, but we're in the position of Brigadier General William P. Carlin's brigade. Now, if you recall earlier, Carlin's brigade was moved to the edge of the Lafayette Road where they were ordered to lay down. Hans Haig's brigade was ordered into the woods where they began engaging entrenched Confederates. Well, remember, simultaneously, Carlin's brigade was just right here in this area. So they were ordered into what would have been a wheat field at the time of the battle. And Carlin would state that's when the slaughter commenced. So his men entered the field here, taking up this position here. Now, as you can see, there is a lot of differences between where we are and where we've been here in Chickamauga. So lots of thick foliage, forests, dense trees, and now we are essentially out in the open in what would have been a wheat field. So you can kind of see we're pretty exposed here. So Hans Haig's brigade was being pushed back. Now entering the fray here would have been Robertson's Texans and Benning's Georgians, and they were coming into line of battle right here. So you had Carlin's brigade beginning to take fire from the woodline here, and also forming line of battle to our front was a brigade under the command of Colonel Robert Trigg and his mixed brigade, and they began taking up positions to our front here. So now Carlin's brigade is essentially in no man's land here. Now, despite the casualties, and they fell back a little bit, but the line here stabilized momentarily. Now, just as Carlin's brigade was beginning to falter, reinforcements arrived under the command of Colonel Sidney Barnes. Now, his brigade would arrive from this general direction here, but they did something a little weird. They came into the field, moving diagonally across Viniard Field here, crossing right in front of Carlin's brigade, and their goal was to hit the Confederates on the flank in the woodline here. However, they failed to realize that Trigg and his mixed brigade were in this woodline to our front, and they were enfilading Barnes's brigade, who quickly broke, and in turn, those fleeing soldiers intermingled with Carlin's brigade in this general direction, and both brigades were now fleeing for the rear, across the Lafayette Road and towards that woodline in the distance. So now we are currently looking at that woodline where Colonel Robert Trigg and his brigade were sheltered, delivering withering flanking fire into the flank of Union Brigade of Colonel Sidney Barnes. So Carlin's men, who were in position just over there, broke, Barnes's men broke, and now all that was left to our front was a lonely Union battery, the 8th Indiana, under the command of Captain George Estep. So that battery was all alone now without any infantry support. So Colonel Robert Trigg waiting in this wood line, saw a target of opportunity. So he ordered his brigade forward to capture that Union battery. But before the whole brigade began advancing, Trigg received orders to shift his brigade north in this general direction here, following the tree line, to support Robertson's Texans in this general area. But before that order was disseminated, the 6th Florida would emerge from this wood line to our front all alone, and they began advancing across this very field.
The regiment moved forward through the open field at a double quick to the crest of the ridge, the distance of about 300 yards. Colonel Jesse Finley, Commander 6th Florida Infantry.
Now let's imagine we're in the 6th Florida advancing across Viniard Field here. We have the 8th Indiana Battery to our front, completely unsupported. There's a whole gaggle of confusion going on up there. The 8th Indiana can't fire because they're still retreating soldiers in front of their muzzles, so they don't want friendly fire. So we're essentially advancing unmolested thus far. But unfortunately for the men of the 6th Florida, we're advancing unsupported. And there are other Union batteries along the high ground to our front that are beginning to deliver canister and point-blank shots into our ranks, men dropping with each step. And you can imagine the disbelief as the commander of the 6th Florida, Jesse Finley, is leading his men forward, and he realizes the rest of the brigade is not advancing. But he kept advancing because artillery is everything in the American Civil War, and if you can capture these guns, you're decreasing the enemy's firepower. So we're about halfway across Viniard Field here, and just imagine the noise, the devastation taking place. But yet the men of the 6th Florida kept advancing, and now they're threatening the Union line.
I never was in just such a place. Before, it is strange to me how anyone escaped, for I assure you that the bullets seemed to search every nook and corner of the field that we were in. Hugh Black's 6th Florida Infantry.
So the 6th Florida would essentially get to point-blank range and deliver a volley amongst the retreating Union and 8th Indiana Battery, causing devastating casualties. But you can't see on the other side of the road here. That's the LaFayette Road. It's just behind that rise. And behind the LaFayette Road is Union reinforcements. So sent this way was the 100th Illinois Infantry under the command of Colonel Frederick Bartleson. And the one-armed Bartleson, along with 2 other regiments from Wilder's Lightning Brigade, were ordered forward to drive the 6th Florida back. So, as you can see, like other places here on the Chickamauga battlefield, Viniard Field is just the scene of unprecedented carnage. You have Union coming in, driving back Confederates, Confederates coming back, driving back the Union, and the bodies are just piling up in this field. And there's a lot of moving parts in this area, so it's really easy to get confused. Unfortunately for the men engaged here, the fighting was not over. We merely covered a portion of the fighting here at Viniard Field, and now we're going to cover the next portion in the next episode.